Absolute pleasure to be here to talk to you all about my favourite topic. Of course, that is gut health. And more specifically, if gut health really is the secret to happiness. Now, as most of you would be aware, I spend most of my days as a researcher. So, in true researcher style, I wanted to collect some baseline data from you. Using a good old-fashioned hands, I wanted people to raise their hands if they think at the minute gut health really is the secret to happiness. And then I'll repeat the same question at the end of my talk to see whether I've changed opinions or not. So, who thinks A, yes, gut health is the secret to happiness? Okay, maybe 30% of people. Who thinks no, B, it's a bit of a fad? Also, yeah, about 15%. Okay, and who's not quite sure? Who's C? Oh gee, a lot of pressure on me. Hopefully I can change your opinion there. And who's actually going to admit to D? They're not quite sure what gut health actually is. Yeah, well done, guys, because, there's a lot of hype in the media around gut health. But unfortunately, the media hype around gut health is just one aspect of gut health. So what actually is gut health? Well, gut health relates to the functioning of our entire digestive tract. So the tube that delivers food from entry all the way to exit. And I think it's important that we know about these different sections. So there are 4 key parts. The first one is our food pipe, which is kind of like a bit of a slippery slide. Our food goes straight down and lands into our stomach. Now, our stomach is kind of like a washing machine. It really does chuck our food around. It also releases different detergents and acids to clean our food and help further break it down. Now, once our food is more like a puree consistency, it makes its way to the 3rd section, and that is the small intestine. Now, I'm not sure who came up with that name, but it is a bit of an odd name because the small intestine is certainly not small by size. It's around 7 meters long. Now, the reason it's so long is because it's got a very important job. The small intestine is where most of our nutrients are absorbed. So things like most of our carbohydrates, our proteins, and our fats get from our gut actually into our blood. And that's where that absorption occurs into our body. And then there's the 4th part. Now, this part wasn't really looked at much, only until recently. It was kind of thought, the large intestine or the colon, it's a bit of that's where poo is made. Let's not really talk about that. But in the last couple of years, we've discovered, and a bit of a claim to fame to the large intestine, because this is where the trillions of microorganisms live. Now, these trillions of microorganisms collectively is called our gut microbiota. Now, who's heard of that word before, gut microbiota? Right? Good, about 70% of people, fantastic. What actually is the gut microbiota, though? Well, it's not just bacteria. Although when we're talking about it, often we'll just say the bacteria to keep things a little bit simple, but I think it's important to realize that it's so much more than bacteria. They do predominate, but there's also viruses and also fungi, such as yeast, which synergistically work together. Now, for some people, this can be a little bit intimidating, going, oh my God, I've got viruses and yeast living in me, but this is a good thing. They do so many beneficial things for us. In fact, without our gut microbiota, we probably couldn't survive. Now, some fun facts, again, some of you who are really into this area may have already heard that things like our gut microbiota weighs as much as our brain, and it's called an acquired organ because unlike our other organs, we're actually not born with it. We develop it over the first couple of years of life. Another fun fact, if you count all of the cells in the human body, we're actually more microbes than we are humans. So effectively, you and I, guys, we're kind of like aliens in disguise. They do outnumber us. Now, the other point which I think is really, really important to remember is when we think about the genetic material, which kind of suggests the functionality, our microbes have so many more genes than the human cells. So essentially, they've got a lot of functionality. We really need them to do so many things for us. So that's why it really is a synergistic relationship with humans and microbes in the human body. So what sort of things do they do? Well, one of the obvious ones is they actually help digest some of our food. in particular dietary fibre. So dietary fibre is found in all our plant-based foods like our fruit, veggies, whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, etc. Now the thing with dietary fibre is humans actually don't contain the enzymes needed to break it down. We are solely reliant on our microbes to digest dietary fibre. Now, other things the microbes do is they make many different vitamins and hormones for us. They're so important for training our immune system. And it's thought actually differences in people's microbiota may actually explain some differences in whether people are getting sick or they have an autoimmune condition. And then the thing that we're really going to be focusing over the next 35 minutes is, of course, how the microbes may actually be talking to our brain. So, like I said, over the next 35 minutes, we're really going to be focusing on this communication between our brain and our gut microbes, and also potentially how we can intervene on that communication through different dietary interventions. Now, as a researcher, I'm always very structured with my presentation, so I want to start off by talking about the mechanisms. So how do we think the gut and the brain are talking to each other? We'll then move on to the evidence. So what are the clinical trials? And then finally, we'll look at the translation. So what does all this actually mean for you today? What can you go home with? So, starting with the mechanisms. Now, to get in the mood, I really want everyone to have a go at activating their gut-brain axis. So for this activity, can I ask everyone to close their eyes? Now, I want you to imagine something that really scares you. Whether it's swimming with a crocodile or a shark or heights or public speaking. Now imagine that thing. Now imagine if I said you have to do that next 5 minutes. Non-negotiable, you have to do that thing in 5 minutes. Okay, don't worry, you're safe. You don't have to do it. Eyes opened, it was just a simulation. But where did you instantly feel that stress and anxiety? In your gut? So right there, that is the perfect example of the gut-brain axis. And in fact, if you think of the way we describe emotions, for centuries we talk about the gut in that. So, someone makes me sick, I've got a gut feeling, you give me the poops. All those sorts of ways we describe emotions have always been through expressions of the gut. So we've known about this link for some time. But there is a new kid on the block, or a new player that we've come to realize. And that is the trillions of microorganisms, i.e. our gut microbiota. So how do they actually communicate with each other? So there's 3 main pathways we've hypothesized. The first one you can kind of think like an alarm system. So it's when our gut microbes sense that something's not right or something's trying to invade us, our gut microbes then send a message to our immune system, and that fires off and releases inflammatory markers which talk to our brain and say, look, you're under stress, we need to think of a plan. So that's number 1. Now the second type of communication is a little bit more common, like us, using the mobile phone. Our gut microbes pretty much pick that up. It's like electrical circuit up nerve systems and talk to our brain. And then the third type is it's like snail mail, so a little bit slower, where the microbes actually produce chemicals and package them up and send them through our blood system, which get delivered to our brain. So there's the 3 main pathways at the minute we're thinking our gut microbes and our brain can communicate. So, we know how they can possibly communicate, but what actually determines what gut microbes you have, and therefore the type of messages they may be sending to your brain? Well, there's, hundreds of different factors that can potentially impact what microbes we have living in us. Now, many of them are things we can't change. We can't go back in time and say, Mum, you should have breastfed me for a bit longer, or you should have had me in a certain way, or you should have let me play with dirt. We can't change many things, but one thing we're all in control of is our diet. Now, there are many different things within our diet which can impact our gut microbiome. Now, one I've already highlighted is, of course, the dietary fibre. And dietary fibre essentially is our gut microbe's favourite food. So it's not food for humans, It's food for microbes. And I guess it's no surprise that all of the healthy foods are high in dietary fiber because, we didn't realize at the time, but we now do, is that these foods are healthy because they're feeding and nurturing all of those microorganisms. Before, we didn't really understand why fiber was in all these plant-based foods, and now we finally see its purpose. Now, one of the other words some people may have heard of, prebiotics. Who's heard of a prebiotic before? Yeah, again, about 80% of people, most people have. So prebiotics is the food for the good bacteria. Now, many prebiotics are actually types of dietary fiber. But instead of dietary fiber kind of being like an open buffet, a prebiotic is a certain type of nutrient which feeds specific gut bacteria. So it's not open to everyone, it's only specific types of gut bacteria which they help grow. And the other P word you may have heard of is probiotics. Now, they're the live microorganisms. They're the things found in a lot of our fermented food, which I'll be talking about at the end of the presentation, as well as things like in the probiotic capsules. Now, they're the three main areas which we think at the minute can really help boost our overall gut microbes. But there are many other factors in our diet which can also have an impact. In fact, if you think about it, anything which enters that large intestine can actually impact our microbes. So things like fat and protein, although majority of them are actually absorbed in our small intestine, if we have large amounts, that can actually get into the large intestine and have an impact. And that's potentially why having a huge steak is probably not a good idea for your gut microbes. Now, one of the other areas is food additives, and my research team within the Department of Nutritional Sciences at King's is currently looking at how different food additives may actually potentially negatively impact our gut microbes, specifically in people who are genetically predisposed to some conditions like inflammatory bowel disease. But that is a talk for another time. So let's bring those aspects together and think about this mental health theory, which is potentially, could there be unhappy microbes in our gut that is then sending messages to our brain and triggering depressive type thoughts? And if that's the case, can we actually intervene on the gut microbes through diet and therefore improve our mental health? So it's all good and well to have mechanisms and hypotheses and ideas, but what does the evidence actually say? So now we're moving on to the evidence part of the talk. And the first question we have to ask ourselves, is there even a link? So the researchers have looked at this and have shown, yes, there is. And how they did that is they took a group of people who were depressed and people who were not depressed. And in research, how we look at the microbes is simply through a poop sample. So we get them to give us a poop sample, and then we put them through special machines and analyze which microbes are there. And you can see here there was a number of different groups of microbes which were really quite different between those who had depression and those who didn't have depression. Now, the next step the researchers did is looked at those who had depression, but they actually treated depression. So they weren't quite as depressed as the previous cohort. And what they found is there were still some differences, but those differences certainly weren't large differences. Now, from that sort of study, it's called an observational study. It's really interesting. We look at different groups and go, oh, okay, there is a clear difference. But it's a bit of a case of the chicken and the egg. Which came first? Was it because they're depressed, so their diet changed and that impacted the gut microbes? Or could it be they've got certain types of microbes and that's actually impacting their mental health? We can't tell from observational studies by just looking at people. So we have to move on to the next higher level evidence, and that's when we actually intervene. We actually give people an intervention and look at what it does. So the landmark study which first showed this communication between our gut microbes was several years ago now, and what they did is they took a group of healthy females and they scanned their brain using this MRI machine. Now, has anyone ever been in an MRI machine before? Okay, yeah, decent. And about 20% of people have. So this here is what it looks like. That's me. We were doing a research study and I was one of the dummies to test for it. So it's this big machine. It goes over your head. And one of the techniques they do is they show you different negative stimuli. And when you look at the images, they look at what parts of your brain actually activate. So they did that with the participants at baseline. They then randomized them either to getting a probiotic yogurt, so remember they've got the good bacteria in them, a yogurt without any bacteria, live bacteria in it, or no product at all. And they were blinded to that, so they didn't know which intervention they get, which is really important because if you know you're going to get something, that can potentially change how you think. So it's really important that these sorts of interventions are blinded. And then they took that every day for 4 weeks and got them to come back and scan their brain again. And what they found was really quite remarkable. Those who had the probiotic intervention actually had less stimulation of a part of their brain known as their amygdala, which is associated with things like emotion. So what the study suggested is that if you're taking the probiotic, perhaps you might be more resilient to negative stimuli that you may experience in life. But of course, these are in healthy people, so there is limited things we can take away from that. But that's the first proof of concept that actually the gut microbes can communicate with the brain. So we next move on to looking actually at people who are depressed. And some researchers did this, so they took people who were depressed and they scanned their brain, so did the similar thing, while showing them those negative stimuli, because remember that's important to find which parts of the brain were activated. And then they randomized them to either getting a probiotic or the placebo. Now the placebo is a fake probiotic, so remember it's blinded, they're not sure which one they're getting. And then they scanned their brain again and found a very similar thing. So there was a different part of their brain activated in those who had the probiotic group. But this time they were able to go a step further and look at the actual clinical translation because these people were depressed. So they asked them a number of questions, and overall they found that those who had the probiotics actually had a lower ranking level of depression compared to those in the fake probiotic group. Anxiety didn't reach significance, but the depression did. So that's really quite powerful to suggest that actually this intervention was impacting people's clinical report of depression and happiness. And one of the other interesting things this study did was looked at the different bacteria chemicals that were produced. And remembering back to the mechanisms, we said one of the pathways is the bacteria-produced metabolites which get into the blood and then communicate up to the brain through the snail mail. So that kind of supports that hypothesis there. Now, another study I want to share with you is in postnatal depression. And why the study is so impressive is that it contained over 400 participants. Now, when we're doing dietary interventions, it is really tricky to recruit to because it's so controlled and they're also really expensive to run. So this sort of number is, doesn't happen very often. So it's really quite important to look at these big studies and have a look at the effects. So what they did, again, they took pregnant mothers who were 15 or 16 weeks gestation, so they were pregnant for 15 to 16 weeks, and they randomized them to either getting a specific type of probiotic or a fake probiotic. Again, they were blinded. They didn't know what they were getting. They took that every day throughout their pregnancy and up until their babies was 6 months old. And they asked them to assess their anxiety levels. And what they found, those in the probiotic group, around 16% would have been classed as having anxiety if they went and saw the doctor. Whereas in the fake probiotic group, so the placebo group, around 30% would have been classed as having anxiety. So by taking that probiotic, essentially it looks like it has dramatically reduced the risk of getting anxiety. Now, this study did also look at depression, and although there was a drop in the depression scores, it didn't actually translate to a number of people who were classified as having postnatal depression versus not. Right, now if I just stopped it there, I think majority of people in this audience would be like, oh my God, I need to take a probiotic. These things are amazing. It's like a miracle. And the reason why is that the 4 studies I've shown you has been 4 of the positive studies. But that's certainly not the case, and it's not very representative when we look at all of the studies that have been done. So this is important when you're, trying to interpret some information or you're reading something in the media. You think, well, actually, what have all the other studies done? And in the research world, how we look at this is called a systematic review. And that's when we get all the studies that ask the same research question and we pull them together. And these researchers did this, and they looked in animals as well, but there was 15 randomized control trials in humans looking at whether probiotics could affect mental health outcomes. And what they actually found was only 8 of those 15 had a positive benefit. So the other 7 had no benefit. So when we look at the big picture of probiotics and mental health, we actually start to see, well, actually, it's not as promising as maybe some headlines want us to believe. And I'll talk about what this actually means for you when we move on to the translation. But I wanted to move on to my favourite study. Now, this study just blows my mind, and I'm very proud to say, I wasn't personally involved, but I'm very proud to say it was undertaken by the Food and Mood Centre in Australia, my Aussie roots coming through there. And why it's my favourite study is because they didn't use supplements. What they did was just diet, and this is where I think we can have big impacts when we just change our diet. So what the researchers did is they took a group of people who had moderate to severe depression, so they were really quite unhappy, and they randomized them to either getting a Mediterranean-style diet, and I'll talk more about what that is. And what they did is they met with a dietitian for 7 sessions over 12 weeks, and they helped counsel them through how to follow this special diet. Now, the other group was considered more like the placebo group, and they had a befriending type of counselling. Now, why that was important to have is because the researchers wanted to make sure that the benefit they were seeing wasn't just because the patient was getting to see a researcher and getting some support, but actually because of the diet. So that's why they had this other type of placebo group where they had that 7-session interaction, but they looked at another type of kind of befriending counselling. And after the 12 weeks, they assessed their depression levels. And what they found is that over 30% of those in the Mediterranean, the diet group, actually would no longer be classed as depressed. So they had a significant improvement in their depression levels to that level, whereas this was only apparent in 8% of those in the placebo group. So I find that hugely powerful to show that changing their diet could actually improve their mental health. Now, I do need to highlight that these patients were still on their medication. They did not change their medication at all. But I think what we can take from this is that if you are on medication, instead of perhaps increasing the dose if it's not working for you, maybe looking at diet in addition to your medication may be beneficial. And for those people who aren't on medication but they feel like they're really not quite happy and maybe they're heading towards depression, perhaps changing your diet before going on to medication could be a really powerful therapy for you. Now, what about the poop? So what about the gut microbiota? Unfortunately, these researchers didn't actually measure that because, measuring poop is a little bit tricky. Not everyone wants to give us a sample of their poop. But there has been many other studies out there which have shown that this type of eating, the Mediterranean-style diet, is really beneficial on our gut microbes. So what does this diet actually look like? Well, here it is. You can see the main things they were having on a daily basis is our plant-based foods. And when we look at the amount of dietary fibre, you see that every day these people had 50 grams of dietary fibre. Remember, that being our gut microbes' favourite food. In the UK, the average fibre intake is 19 grams. So we really are falling short of that gut-loving nutrient. And when we look at the dietary guidelines, they suggest 30 grams of fibre a day, whereas this study did 50. So perhaps if you're already at the 30, maybe you might want to try boost it up a little bit more. If you're at the 19, boosting up to 25 might actually be really beneficial for you. So small gradual steps, but we'll talk more about that soon. You can see there I've highlighted all the plant-based gut-loving foods which were on the daily basis, but also the other aspects of the diet, such as extra virgin olive oil was a really important aspect of their diet. They had quite a lot of it, and that contains different types of compounds called polyphenols, many of which our gut microbes also love to eat and digest. And then they also had dairy, include some fermented dairy such as yogurt, which again may have that benefit. When people look at this, some of them go, oh, okay, I'll just take a fibre supplement. I won't even worry about changing my diet. I'll just, fibre supplement, maybe add some yogurt, maybe a bit of olive oil, that's it. I don't need to add all this other stuff in there. But the thing is, is these dietary changes don't just change dietary fibre. There's many other nutrients which have also been associated with depression. For example, omega-3s are really important for our brain health. B12, selenium, folate, and hydration. So there's many different factors within this Mediterranean-style eating which can be really beneficial for our mental health, whether it's directly or indirectly involved with our gut microbes. Now, I just want to answer the question that a lot of people ask is, okay, so we've been focusing on changing our microbes to improve our mental health, but can changing our mental health improve our gut? And this study has looked at this where they took people with irritable bowel syndrome. So irritable bowel syndrome is something which affects 10% of adults in the UK. And one of the key features of it is you have tummy pain at least 1 day a week, every week, for over 6 months. So it's a chronic condition. So it's not just if you have a once-off tummy ache, it's an ongoing thing. And also it's linked to different types of stool, which we'll talk about, things like bloating, etc. So what the researchers did is they took IBS patients and they randomized them to either getting this gold standard dietary intervention, which my research team does a lot of work in, and is now used over the world for management of irritable bowel syndrome. So we know that works really well. So there's no questioning that one. But what they wanted to do is look at a non-diet approach. They wanted to look at whether they could target just the gut, just the brain, to impact the microbes in the gut and overall symptoms. So they looked at hypnotherapy. And then the third group was randomized to the combination therapy. And when they looked at the overall gut symptoms, what they found was, yes, as we expect, the diet intervention works in around 70% of people, as we've shown in many other clinical trials. But what was so striking is that the hypnotherapy group had a same effect as the diet on their gut symptoms. So these people did not even change, didn't touch their diet at all. All they did was focus on here, and it changed their gut. So that's a really powerful thing. Okay, so now we're moving in the last 13 minutes to the final stage, and that's looking at the translation. So what does this actually all mean for you? Now, one of the most common questions I get when I talk to people about this is actually, how do you know if you've got a healthy gut microbe and then therefore it's sending good messages? Now, unfortunately, there is not one universal way of measuring gut health, but there's a number of little pieces to the puzzle. And one of the things I really think we need to get more involved in is checking in with our poo. And I know a lot of people are probably a bit queasy about that, but it's something that's really important because it can say a lot about our overall gut health. So Bristol stool chart, have a look, have a think about what your normal stool may be. And what we should be aiming for is a type 3, 4, or 5. Now, you might have some curry and get a type 6 or 7 one day of the week, or you might be super stressed and you might have a type 1, every month or something like that. And that's okay, but it's your average poop. If you're a type 1 or 2 or 6 or 7, every day and it's long term, then that might be an area that you could work on. The other thing is how often you're opening your bowels. So what most people, what we would call as, normal, is opening your bowels as little as 3 times a week to as many as 3 times a day. Now, if you're outside of that, then ongoingly, it might be a cause to go, maybe something's at play. Maybe I should look into this a little bit more. Of course, gut symptoms. If you're having really distressing gut symptoms, is another good indicator. And then there's so many other factors that I would look at when I see patients in clinical practice. For example, diet. So not only dietary fibre, but how diverse is your diet? So how many different plant-based foods are you getting in? And why I ask people that is because each different type of plant-based food actually feeds different microbes. So the more diversity from plants you have in your diet, the more diverse your microbes are in your gut, which has been associated with better mental health. Other things like how often you're having medications, antibiotics, how stressed are you? Do you work outdoors in the mud, or are you really quite clean and you spray everything? So there's a number of factors there. Now, in the research world, we'll get a poop sample, and what we'll do is we'll look at not only what microbes are there, but also what the microbes are doing. And this second point is really important because there's a lot of commercial kits out there that promise you the world and say, oh, look, we can tell you about your gut health. We will tell you what microbes you have in you. But the thing is, my research group and many others have shown is that just knowing what microbes you have in you isn't really helpful, because the same microbe can act very different in two different environments. Similarly, two very different microbes can actually do very similar things. So what we're starting to move forward in understanding is we want to know what the microbes are doing. We don't just want to know what microbes are there, and that's going to be a better indication of your overall health. Now, probiotics. What's the translation? Should we all be having probiotics for our mental health? Well, as you saw from that systematic review, the overall evidence is not very strong. So I certainly, as a clinician and as a researcher, wouldn't be suggesting everyone go out and take a probiotic for their mental health. I know, though, that many people are really intrigued in this area and they want to do it. So what I say, if you want to give it a try, give yourself the best bet. And the way you do that is you find out which clinical trials have actually shown a benefit and copy exactly what they did to achieve that benefit. So for those on social media, I have sent a link to this paper, which is that systematic review which goes through all the positive and the negative studies. And the things you need to look for is firstly the type of probiotic. So which probiotic did they give? Now, I've mentioned some high-level names here, like bifidobacteria. The thing is, there are hundreds of different bifidobacteria, and each bifidobacteria can do different things. So you need to find the paper and find the exact name and type of bifidobacteria that they used and try and get a probiotic with that in it. The other thing it's important to note is the dose. So how much are these people actually getting on the day-to-day basis? Because that's what's shown a benefit. So you want to make sure you're replicating that, right? Makes sense? And then the last one is the duration. So how long should you be taking the probiotic before you can expect a benefit? And this is important to make sure you're not wasting your money. And what I recommend, if you do want to take a probiotic, at the start of the intervention, maybe ask yourself a few quick questions and to assess how happy you are. And then at the end of the 4 weeks, or whether it's 12 weeks, whatever the study has shown, you then ask yourself the same questions to see whether you're feeling any different. And if you're not, then go, okay, I'm not going to worry with that, because probiotics can be really expensive. So it's important people aren't wasting their money. Now, I do need to touch on this headline because it did only come out a couple of weeks ago, and so the media picked it up like wildfire. It was crazy how many people were asking me about this, and it all came from one study. Now, this one study was actually a really good study, but it was a perfect example of the miscommunication between researchers and the media, because the researchers were not even looking at the effectiveness of probiotics. They were looking at another research question. Yet the media interpreted it as, oh, probiotics don't work. So I think when we're listening to the media, we need to be very careful of how they've interpreted the data and make sure you go to some reputable resources, which I'll touch on. Now, in terms of the whole body of evidence for probiotics, there is only one indication where I would comfortably suggest that I would recommend that most people should actually take a probiotic. And this is because there's guidelines around this area, and that's for antibiotic-associated diarrhea. So if you have to take a antibiotic for whatever reason, a lot of people, about 30%, up to 30% of people, are at risk of getting diarrhea because the antibiotic disrupts the balance between the different microbes in their gut, so they can get diarrhea. Whereas, studies from thousands of people have now shown that if they take a specific type of probiotic during their antibiotic course, they can reduce their risk of getting that antibiotic-associated diarrhea. Now, if we look at one of the British Dietetic Association resources, they go through some of the more detail around that, including the type of bacteria, it was actually a type of yeast. So there are probiotics which are types of yeast. So it's Saccharomyces boulardii at a dose of 5 billion CFUs twice per day. And it was duration throughout the entire antibiotic regime. Now, the thing that I didn't mention was around CFU. What the heck is a CFU? So when we think about carbs and proteins, we talk about grams, so that's the unit of measure. With probiotics, we talk about CFU, so that's just the number of microbes. So that's what you might see on the packet of the label, the CFU. That's a concentration of microbes. Okay, now in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to be kicked off the stage. So I'll be very quick when I talk about diet. What should we be doing with diets? Now, I think there's been quite a lot of research into the benefits of the Mediterranean diet. Not only the study I showed you, but there's been many other studies showing that the Mediterranean diet is, as well as mental health, is good for your heart health, your kidney health, etc. So I think if we could all eat more plant-based foods towards the Mediterranean style eating, then I think we're going to be in good overall health, including the mental health. The other concept is around plant-based diversity. And I did briefly touch on that, and that's trying to not just hit your fibre targets, but try and get as many different plant-based species in a week. And what I usually suggest is people aim for around 30 different plant-based species a week. Now, I get some people like, oh my God, are you serious? One, she's telling me to eat more fibre. Now I have to eat more different types of fibre as well. Now, it's really just about where you're at. And when it comes to the diversity, if you're still struggling to get, 3 serves of veg and 4 serves of 4 serves of veg and 2 serves of fruit in a day, if you're still struggling with that, then don't worry about diversity. I don't want you to get confused by that. But if you're ready for the next level, then that's where diversity comes in. So trying to get as many different types. And things like herbs and spices count to your 30, whole grains, nuts, seeds, all those sorts of things. And one little simple tip, for example, if you're at the shops and you're buying a pepper, don't just go for the red pepper. Get the combination pack, which also has a yellow pepper and a green pepper and a red pepper, because each type has different types of nutrients which feeds different microbes. So trying to, where you can, get that diversity. Switch it, don't ditch it is just something I like to say to highlight that we are trying to get changes which last for a long time. We don't just, have a fad diet where, for a week we might go Mediterranean. We need to make small changes that are going to last. So if someone said to me, look, you can't have dessert anymore, I'd be like, oh my God, maybe I could survive a week, but that's it. So the thing is, you should switch up what you currently have. If you're having something like ice cream and cake for dessert, why not switch it up to having something like a live yogurt with some berries and dark chocolate, instead of just going cold turkey with your dessert. So thinking about that, I think, is important. The other point is around dietary fibre. Now, anyone who has had a binge on a lot of fruit and veggies will know that if they eat too much all at once, they might get a little bit of bloating. And that's because when the bacteria actually eat the fibre, one of the things they release is gas. Now, that's actually a really beneficial thing. In fact, we all pass wind around 20 times a day, so it's completely normal. It's a sign of a well-fed microbe. But you don't want to overwhelm your body all at once. So don't go from 10 grams of fibre to 40 grams of fibre in a week. It's about slow, gradual increases to give your gut time to adapt. And your gut really will adapt, and you won't, you'll be at 40 grams and not have any gut symptoms, but it needs that time to increase. Okay, 2 minutes ago, I'm really impressed with my timing. So the take-home messages, we talked about mechanisms, we talked about how real the gut-brain axis is and that you guys all experienced. We also talked about the different communication pathways, those 3 different pathways. We looked at the evidence and where we saw that maybe probiotics could work for some people, but probably looking at whole diet is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. And then we looked at translation. So we talked about actually maybe we should start looking at our poop a little bit more and looking at things like the diversity of our diet and our symptoms and paying more attention to them. And then also, when it comes to supplements, I wouldn't recommend them. If you want to, the different areas or the different strategies I've suggested that you should follow, including the dose, the duration and the indication. And then lastly, looking at the plant-based diversity. So trying to get as many different things if you can, as well as that Mediterranean-style eating. Now, 1 minute to go, there is a little bit more. If you are wanting to know more about gut health, the British Dietetic Association have a stand where they've got some more info facts on gut health, as well as the opportunity to speak to dietitians who work in the area of gut health. So certainly worth dropping in there. King's College also have a stand. Now, it's indirectly related to the gut, but what they do is they take a picture of your heart and you can actually watch it beat. So it's really cool tech. And then lastly, I did say I would be talking more about fermented foods, and that will be That will be on in about an hour over at the Speakeasy area, and I'll be looking at kefir, which is a type of a fermented milk, something I literally make every day, and I swear by it. The evidence is not strong, not because it isn't good evidence, but it's just the studies haven't been done yet. And then I'll also do plenty of questions and answer time in case I don't get it after now, because I think I'm out of time. Oh, we didn't, no, sorry. We need to end this intervention and find out whether I changed opinions or not. So, who thinks gut health is the secret to happiness? Hands up. Okay, I think we did. Most people are hands up there. Who thinks no? Who thinks it's still a bit of a fad? About 2% of people? Okay, good point. And who thinks, see, they're still unsure, we just need more research? About 15? Yep. And hopefully if I've done my job, you all now know what gut health actually is. Okay, I will leave you there. Thanks, guys.